Christmas was never just a holiday in our family. It was a promise. No matter what the year had taken from us, Christmas Eve was when everything returned to its place. The table was always too small, the food always too much, the laughter always loud enough to spill into the hallway. For as long as I can remember, Christmas meant safety. It meant belonging without conditions. It meant that whatever disagreements existed the rest of the year were temporarily forgiven, in exchange for shared traditions and familiar warmth. I grew up believing this was unbreakable. Every December, our routines unfolded like clockwork. My mother's old ornaments came down from the attic, each one carrying a story we'd told 100 times before. My father insisted on the same carols, always too loud, always off-key. We complained, but secretly we relied on that predictability. It anchored us. It told us who we were. Christmas Eve, especially, was sacred. No matter where life scattered us, we came home that night, always. As I got older, I carried that belief with me like a shield. When life disappointed me, when relationships frayed or plans collapsed, I told myself at least Christmas would be there. At least my family would be. It's strange how we assign permanence to traditions, as if repetition alone can make something indestructible. I never questioned it. I didn't think I needed to. Even after I moved out, even after the family dynamic subtly shifted the way it always does with time, Christmas Eve remained untouched. Or so I thought. We smiled through small tensions, ignored uncomfortable silences, and called it togetherness. I told myself that's what families do. You smooth the surface and keep moving forward. You don't ask why certain conversations stop when you enter the room. You don't dwell on why plans are discussed without you and then quickly revised. I noticed things, of course. I just didn't name them. There were years when my opinions felt less welcome, when jokes landed awkwardly, when my presence felt tolerated rather than celebrated. But I explained it away. Stress, aging parents, busy lives, families change, I told myself, but traditions hold. Christmas was proof of that. Christmas Eve was the reset button. Whatever distance crept in during the year would disappear once we were all under the same roof. That belief shaped how I saw myself within the family. I was the reliable one, the flexible one, the one who didn't cause trouble. I prided myself on keeping the peace, on not rocking the boat. If something felt off, I adjusted. I learned early that belonging often comes with conditions, even when we pretend it doesn't. Still, I believed love was underneath it all, steady and unquestionable. This particular Christmas approached quietly. No arguments, no announcements, just the usual group messages about food assignments and arrival times. Everything looked normal on the surface. I should have been comforted by that. Instead, a faint unease followed me through the days leading up to Christmas Eve. Conversations felt shorter. Replies came later. Details were vague where they hadn't been before. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, I had no reason to doubt them. This was my family. These were the people who had wrapped me in blankets when I was sick, who knew my childhood fears, who had watched me grow into myself. Christmas wasn't just something we celebrated together. It was something that defined us. The idea that it could become a weapon instead of a refuge never crossed my mind. Still, small things tugged at my attention. A change in the usual arrival time. A hesitation when I asked a simple question. The way my name was skipped over in a conversation that assumed I'd understand later. Each moment was insignificant on its own, easy to ignore. Together, they formed a pattern I refused to see. Trust can make us blind, especially when we're afraid of what clarity might cost us. I focused on the familiar instead. The smell of pine. The ritual of wrapping gifts. The comfort of knowing where I would be on Christmas Eve as I had always known. I reminded myself that family doesn't always express love perfectly, but it endures. That belief calmed me. It always had. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve, I felt that familiar anticipation rise in my chest. I packed gifts, double-checked directions I knew by heart, and told myself everything was fine. Whatever tension I sensed would dissolve once I arrived. It always did. The door would open, voices would greet me, and I would step back into the version of myself that only existed there. The first sign was the group chat. It was nothing dramatic, no accusations, no slammed doors through a screen, just a strange thinning of conversation, like someone had turned down the volume on everyone at once. Every year, my sister flooded the thread with pictures of wrapping paper explosions and half-burnt cookies. My mother sent voice notes that began with "now don't laugh," but and ended with a story that made no sense until the punchline. Even my father, who treated texting like a chore, would toss in a thumbs up and call it participation. This year, the messages came clipped, practical. "What time are you coming? Who's bringing dessert? Don't forget the extra chairs." The warmth was still there in theory, but it had the brittle feel of something rehearsed. I told myself people were tired. Everyone was busy. Still, I noticed how my questions were answered last, how they weren't ignored exactly, just delayed long enough to make me feel foolish for asking. When I wrote, "Should I bring the cranberry sauce like last year?" my sister replied, "Sure," and nothing else. No emoji, no "can't wait to see you." It shouldn't have mattered, yet it did. The absence of enthusiasm felt like a missing ornament on a tree you've decorated 100 times. You can't explain why it feels wrong, but you keep glancing back at the bare spot. In the grocery store, I caught myself rereading old texts from previous Decembers, as if proof of the past could steady the present. But my intuition, quiet, persistent, kept tapping at me like a knuckle on glass. Then came the phone calls. I called my mother 3 days before Christmas Eve, just to hear her voice. She answered on the third ring, but her greeting sounded slightly breathless, as if I'd caught her in the middle of something. "Oh, hi," she said, and there was a pause that shouldn't have been there. My mother never paused with me. She always filled space with questions, suggestions, opinions. "How are you doing?" I asked. "Fine, fine," she replied quickly. "Busy, you know how it is." I waited for her to ask about me, about my plans, about whether I'd finished shopping. Instead, she asked, "Are you still coming tomorrow?" The question landed wrong, not because it was unreasonable, but because it sounded like she needed confirmation, like my presence was a variable she wasn't sure she could accommodate. I felt that faint unease curl tighter in my stomach. "Of course," I said lightly, "like always." "Good," she answered too quickly. Then she changed the subject to the weather. The festive appearances continued. My feed filled with family photos in matching pajamas, mugs of cocoa, twinkling lights. My sister posted a selfie with the caption, "Christmas chaos starts now," and tagged everyone but me. That might have been an accident, yet my mind caught it and held it up to the light, turning it slowly. I told myself not to be sensitive. Denial has a soothing voice. It says, "Don't make it bigger than it is. Don't ruin things, don't be the problem." And I listened. On December 23rd, my brother called, rare enough that I answered immediately. His voice sounded normal, almost cheerful. "Hey," he said, "just checking in." "Checking in," I repeated, trying to keep it casual. "Yeah, you're good for tomorrow, right? You know the new time." "There's a new time?" I asked, and my heart did a small, anxious flip. He hesitated, just a beat too long. "Mom didn't tell you. We're starting a little earlier, 6 instead of 7. Earlier, not later. Not canceled. Just earlier. A small change that felt like a large one because no one had mentioned it until now. A tiny crack beneath the decorations. "No problem," I said. "Thanks for telling me." "Great," he said, and then, as if remembering something important, added, "And don't come too early, okay? Like, don't show up before 6. I laughed because it sounded like a joke. "Why would I? I'm not that eager." "Yeah," he said, but his laugh didn't match mine. It was thin, controlled. "Just, traffic stuff." After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, staring at my reflection in the dark window. The Christmas lights on my balcony blinked steadily, quietly cheerful and oblivious. Festive on the outside, unease on the inside. My mind began assembling the small moments into a picture I didn't want to see. I tried to dismantle it. I told myself families get stressed. People get weird around holidays. I reminded myself that I was prone to overthinking, that my job had been exhausting lately, that I was reading tone where there was none. Intuition versus denial, wrestling quietly in my chest. That night, I wrapped gifts with extra care, pressing down each piece of tape like a promise. I practiced my smile in the mirror. I planned my outfit. I even baked cookies because bringing something sweet felt like a way to contribute, to earn my place. The irony didn't hit me until later, that I was trying to secure belonging in a family I had believed was automatic. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived cold and bright. I drove to the mall for a last-minute gift bag, listening to carols on the radio, letting the familiar songs soothe me. "It's just holiday stress," I whispered to myself at a red light. "That's all." But my body didn't believe it. My shoulders stayed tense. My jaw ached from clenching. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach tightened, expecting a message that would confirm what I didn't want to admit. When the messages came, they were normal on the surface. "See you tonight. Bring the cookies." And yet the words felt staged, like lines in a play everyone else had rehearsed. By late afternoon, as I loaded the gifts into my car, I realized I was preparing for Christmas Eve the way you prepare for an interview. Polished, cautious, desperate not to say the wrong thing. That wasn't how family was supposed to feel. Still, I clung to tradition like a lifeline. I told myself that once I walked through that door, the cracks would disappear beneath the noise and the food and the familiar chaos. I believed in the old magic, that Christmas Eve could smooth over anything, that belonging could be restored with a hug and a plate of dinner. So I drove toward their house with the heater blasting, the cookies cooling on the passenger seat, and denial riding shotgun, quietly insisting that whatever my intuition was sensing, it couldn't possibly be real. I pulled into the driveway with the kind of nervous excitement that feels almost childlike, the kind you try to outgrow but never really do. The house was glowing, every window warm and golden, strings of lights tracing the roofline like a promise kept. For a moment, everything inside me relaxed. I was early enough, right on time, exactly where I was supposed to be. Christmas Eve had arrived, and so had I. I turned off the engine and sat there for a second, listening. I could hear laughter through the walls, muffled but unmistakable. Plates clinked. Music played softly, the same carols we always played. It felt reassuring, like proof that my unease had been unfounded. Whatever tension I'd imagined dissolved in that sound. I grabbed the cookies, the gifts, and stepped out into the cold. The air bit at my face as I walked up the path. My breath fogged in front of me, and my shoes crunched against the gravel. I adjusted the bags in my arms and reached the front door, already picturing it opening, already preparing my smile. I knocked once lightly, the way I always did. Nothing happened. I waited, listening for footsteps, for someone calling my name. The laughter continued inside, rising and falling like waves. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I checked my phone, wondering if I'd somehow gotten the time wrong. It was 6 on the dot, exactly when they told me to come. A flicker of confusion passed through me, followed quickly by embarrassment. Maybe they hadn't heard me. The music might be too loud. I knocked again, firm now, my knuckles stinging slightly from the cold. The sound echoed against the door and vanished. Inside, someone laughed again, a voice I recognized, clear and close. They were right there. I stepped back and tried the handle. It didn't move. Locked. That was when the moment shifted from strange to unreal. My brain resisted the conclusion forming in front of me, scrambling for explanations that didn't hurt. Maybe they'd locked it out of habit. Maybe they were in the back of the house. Maybe someone would open it any second now and laugh, apologizing for the delay. I waited. Seconds stretched. The cold seeped through my coat, through my gloves. I shifted my weight, the bags growing heavier in my arms. I knocked again, harder than before, the sound sharp and urgent. I pressed the doorbell once, then again. The chime rang inside, cheerful and oblivious. No one came. I stepped off the porch and stared through the window beside the door. The living room was full. I could see them clearly now, my mother at the table, my sister pouring drinks, my brother leaning against the counter. They were close enough that I could see their faces, their smiles, the casual ease of people who felt safe. No one looked toward the door. My phone buzzed in my hand as I dialed my sister. It rang, once, twice, then voicemail. I tried my mother, voicemail, my brother, voicemail. Each unanswered call tightened something in my chest until it hurt to breathe. I knocked again, this time with my fist, my heart pounding in my ears. The laughter inside continued, uninterrupted. Someone turned up the music slightly. The carols swelled, bright and cruel. I felt myself shrinking, standing there on the porch like a child who'd misunderstood an invitation. Heat rushed to my face despite the cold. Humiliation wrapped around me, heavy and suffocating. I looked down at the cookies, at the carefully wrapped gifts, at the effort I had made to belong. A part of me wanted to scream. Another part wanted to disappear. I checked the door one more time, as if it might have changed its mind. It hadn't. The lock was solid, unyielding. A physical boundary that mirrored something deeper, something I hadn't wanted to acknowledge until now. The cold crept into my fingers, numbing them. I set the bags down slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement might break me. I leaned against the railing and tried to steady my breathing. The house loomed in front of me, familiar and foreign at the same time. Celebration and rejection existed side by side, separated by a few inches of wood and glass. I sent a text, "I'm here." The message showed as delivered. No reply. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds. Time felt distorted, stretched thin by disbelief. I watched as shadows moved inside, as people crossed the room, as glasses were raised in toast. At one point, I saw my sister glance toward the window, her eyes skimming past me without recognition. Or maybe she saw me and chose not to react. I couldn't tell which was worse. The laughter rose again, louder now, and something inside me cracked. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't bad timing. This was deliberate. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to conserve warmth, trying to hold myself together. My mind raced, flipping through every conversation, every moment from the past few days, searching for the explanation that would make this hurt less. Nothing fit. Nothing justified this silence. A car passed on the street, headlights sweeping briefly across the porch, illuminating me like a spotlight. I felt exposed, ridiculous, frozen in place. If anyone looked out now, they would see me standing there, locked out of my own family's Christmas. I picked up my phone again and typed, then erased, then typed. Did I do something wrong? I didn't send it. The question felt too raw, too vulnerable to offer to people who had already made their choice. Inside, someone started handing out plates. I could see the steam rising from the food. Smell it even, carried faintly through the door. My stomach twisted, not with hunger but with grief. Christmas Eve, the night that had always meant home, had turned into a lesson I hadn't known I needed to learn. Eventually, my hands were shaking too badly to ignore. From the cold, yes, but also from the shock settling deep into my bones. I picked up the gifts again, feeling foolish, and stepped back from the door. Each step away felt heavier than the last. I stood at the edge of the driveway and looked back one final time. The lights glowed steadily. The house was full. I was not welcome. As I turned toward my car, a thought landed with terrifying clarity. Whatever was happening inside that house had been decided long before I arrived. The lock hadn't closed me out. It had revealed the truth. And as I drove away into the dark, Christmas music still playing softly inside, I realized that the cold I felt had nothing to do with the weather. I don't remember starting the car. I only remember the cold following me inside, clinging to my skin as if it had claimed me. My hands shook on the steering wheel, not violently, just enough to remind me that something inside me had gone loose. The heater blasted warm air, but it did nothing. The cold wasn't on my body anymore. It had moved somewhere deeper. I pulled over a few streets away and turned off the engine. The sudden quiet was unbearable. Christmas music faded into static, and I shut it off completely. Silence rushed in, thick and heavy, pressing against my ears. That silence felt louder than the laughter I had left behind. It felt intentional. Confusion came first. It wrapped around me like fog, dulling the sharpness of what had happened. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe someone would call any second, apologizing breathlessly. I stared at my phone, willing it to light up. It didn't. Each passing moment made the truth harder to escape. Then came shame. I replayed the image of myself standing on that porch, arms full of gifts, knocking on a door that never opened. The humiliation burned hotter than the cold ever had. I imagined how I must have looked if anyone had seen me, hopeful, unaware, rejected. I felt exposed in a way I never had before, as if my need for belonging had been put on public display and dismissed. Fear followed close behind, quiet and insidious. Not fear of physical danger, but fear of what this meant. Fear that something fundamental had shifted without my consent. Families don't lock each other out on Christmas Eve by accident. That realization settled heavily in my chest. If this could happen now, what else had I misunderstood all these years? I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes. Memories came flooding in uninvited. Christmas mornings from childhood, tearing wrapping paper while my parents laughed. Late nights as adults, wine glasses clinking, arguments dissolving into jokes. I remembered feeling certain then, certain that no matter how complicated life became, this was where I belonged. The contrast was unbearable. Past warmth collided violently with present cold, leaving me suspended between two realities. One where I was loved, included, safe. Another where I was outside, unwanted, erased. I didn't know which version of my life was real anymore. My phone buzzed suddenly, and my heart leapt painfully before sinking just as fast. A notification, not from them. A generic holiday message from a coworker. The disappointment was sharp enough to make my eyes sting. I turned the phone face down, as if that might stop the ache. I tried to breathe steadily, counting each inhale, each exhale. Therapists talk about grounding, about staying present, but the present felt hostile. The past felt safer, even though it was slipping away from me. I clung to it anyway, replaying moments where I felt seen, loved, chosen. I needed proof that I hadn't imagined everything. Abandonment is a strange thing. It doesn't arrive all at once. It unfolds slowly, with questions instead of answers. Why didn't they open the door? What did I miss? When did this decision happen? Each question chipped away at my sense of self-worth. I felt myself shrinking, folding inward, trying to make sense of a rejection that had no explanation. I drove aimlessly for a while, streets blurring together, houses glowing with lights that felt almost cruel in their cheer. Families gathered. Doors opened. I passed windows full of warmth and noise and felt like a ghost drifting through someone else's life. The world hadn't stopped for me. Christmas was happening everywhere, just not where I belonged. Eventually, I parked near a small park and stepped out of the car. The cold air hit me again, sharp and bracing. I welcomed it. It matched how I felt. I sat on a bench and pulled my coat tighter, staring at the dark outlines of trees strung with lights. Somewhere nearby, children laughed. The sound made my chest ache. I thought about calling someone, a friend, anyone, but I didn't want to explain. I didn't want to hear pity in someone's voice. Silence felt safer than trying to justify my pain. So I stayed quiet, alone with my thoughts, letting them tumble freely for the first time. I wondered if I had always been the extra one. The one included out of habit rather than desire. I revisited old moments with new eyes, times I'd been talked over, decisions made without me, jokes that landed just a little too close to truth. Had I mistaken tolerance for love? The question hurt more than the cold ever could. Tears came eventually, slow and heavy. Not dramatic sobs, just steady, exhausted crying. I let them fall. There was no one to see, no one to reassure or correct me. Just me, sitting in the quiet, mourning something I hadn't realized I was losing. I thought about turning back, about knocking again, demanding answers. But the idea filled me with dread. Vulnerability had already cost me enough. I couldn't bear to offer more of myself to people who had chosen silence over honesty. So I stayed away, wrapped in the ache of unanswered questions. Time passed strangely. Minutes stretched. The cold seeped into my bones again, urging me to move. I stood, brushed off my coat, and returned to the car. As I drove home, I felt numb, suspended between disbelief and acceptance. The night felt endless, heavy with meaning I wasn't ready to unpack. When I finally reached my apartment, it was dark and quiet. I set the gifts down by the door, untouched. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood there, listening to the silence, letting it settle around me. This, too, was Christmas Eve now. Lying in bed later, staring at the ceiling, I understood something painful and important. Being locked out hadn't just taken away one night. It had cracked open years of assumptions. The cold outside had mirrored a truth I hadn't wanted to face. Belonging that depends on silence isn't belonging at all. And as the night deepened, with no messages, no explanations, no apologies, I realized that the hardest part wasn't the rejection. It was the understanding that I had been alone in that family long before the door ever closed. Sleep never really came that night. I drifted in and out of it, trapped in a half-awake state where thoughts refused to settle. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind pulled me backward, rewinding my life like footage slowed down frame by frame. If they had locked me out on Christmas Eve, there had to be a reason. Families don't draw lines that sharply without justification. So I began the search in the only place I could, myself. I replayed conversations from years ago, scrutinizing every word I had spoken, every opinion I had voiced. Had I been too honest? Too distant? Too much myself? I remembered moments when my silence had been noticed, moments when my presence felt optional rather than essential. At the time, I told myself it was maturity, independence, the natural shift of adulthood. Now those same moments felt like evidence I had failed some unspoken test. Self-blame arrived easily. It always does when answers are withheld. I thought about how I was different from the rest of them. I didn't always agree. I asked questions when others preferred comfort. I had moved away for a while, built a life that didn't revolve entirely around the family orbit. I told myself independence was healthy, but maybe they had seen it as rejection. Maybe my distance had made them feel less secure, less in control. The idea stung. Loyalty in our family was never discussed openly, but it was expected. You showed it by showing up, by not challenging traditions, by blending in. I had always shown up, hadn't I? But maybe I hadn't blended in enough. Maybe my loyalty had come with conditions they didn't appreciate: honesty, boundaries, individuality. Old dynamics resurfaced as my mind dug deeper. I remembered how I was often cast as the reasonable one, the mediator, the person expected to smooth things over. I had learned early that my role was to absorb tension so others didn't have to. I rarely complained. I rarely demanded. That pattern had earned me approval once. Had it slowly trained them to believe I wouldn't push back now? Quiet resentment surfaced alongside these thoughts, uncomfortable but undeniable. I realized how often I had swallowed my feelings to preserve peace. How many times I had laughed off comments that hurt, excused behavior that left me feeling small. Loyalty, I was starting to see, had required more sacrifice from me than from anyone else. I wondered if they had mistaken my endurance for indifference. As the hours passed, questions grew sharper, more precise. When had plans started happening without me? When had my presence become negotiable? I recalled holidays where decisions were made before I arrived, where I was informed rather than consulted. At the time, I brushed it off as efficiency. Now it felt like exclusion in slow motion. The realization hurt, but it also brought clarity. Self-blame began to give way to self-awareness. This wasn't about one mistake or one argument. It was about years of imbalance, of expectations quietly shifting without my consent. I hadn't done something wrong. I had simply stopped fitting into a version of the family that required compliance over authenticity. Still, doubt lingered. I examined my flaws honestly. I knew I could be reserved, slow to share emotions, hesitant to ask for help. Maybe they interpreted that as distance. Maybe my self-sufficiency made me easier to exclude. If I didn't need them, maybe they believed I wouldn't mind being left out. That thought cut deeply. I had needed them. I just hadn't known how to say it without feeling like a burden. I sat at my kitchen table as dawn crept in, light spilling quietly across the floor. The world looked the same as it always had, but I felt changed. The shock had softened into something steadier, heavier. Inquiry replaced disbelief. I wasn't searching for excuses anymore. I was searching for truth. I thought about the unspoken rules that governed our family. Don't challenge too much. Don't make others uncomfortable. Don't disrupt the image. I had broken those rules simply by existing as I was. I hadn't been dramatic or cruel or careless. I had just been honest in small ways, consistent in my refusal to disappear entirely. maybe that was enough. The idea frightened me and strengthened me at the same time. If this wasn't about something I'd done wrong, then it meant the rejection wasn't mine to fix. It meant the pain wasn't proof of my failure. That realization loosened something tight in my chest, even as it introduced a new kind of grief. I mourned the family I thought I had, the one where love was unconditional, where belonging didn't require silence. I mourned the version of myself who believed that enduring quietly would eventually earn security. That version had survived by shrinking. I wasn't sure I wanted to keep living that way. By mid-morning, exhaustion settled over me, but it was different from the night before. Less frantic, more resolute. The questions remained, but they no longer pointed inward with accusation. They pointed outward, toward patterns and choices that weren't mine alone. I realized then that understanding why they locked me out wouldn't necessarily bring comfort, but understanding who I was in that story mattered more. I wasn't the careless one. I wasn't the problem that needed to be managed. I was someone who had outgrown a role designed to keep the peace at my expense. The betrayal still hurt, the silence still echoed, but beneath it all, a quiet shift was happening. Inquiry was turning into insight. Self-blame was loosening its grip, making room for something sturdier, self-respect. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew this much. Whatever explanation eventually surfaced, it would have to reckon with the truth that I had been loyal for a long time. And loyalty, when it's one-sided, eventually demands to be questioned. As the day unfolded, I sensed that this search for answers was only the beginning. What I uncovered next wouldn't just explain the lock on the door. It would force me to confront the deeper truth about where I belonged, and whether I still wanted to belong there at all. The truth didn't arrive as a confession. It came in fragments, slipped carelessly into conversations that were never meant to explain anything. Silence had protected something for a long time, and once I started listening closely, I realized how carefully it had been maintained. The first crack appeared the next afternoon when my aunt called. Her voice was cautious, overly gentle, the way people sound when they know they're stepping into something fragile. She didn't ask how my Christmas Eve had been. Instead, she asked, "Are you holding up okay?" That question carried more weight than it should have. I told her I was fine because that was easier than admitting I was. There was a pause, heavy and revealing. Then she sighed. "I wish things hadn't happened the way they did," she said quietly. Things. The word landed like a confession disguised as politeness. "What things?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time. Silence stretched, thick with meaning. When she finally spoke, her voice dropped. "They thought it would be better this way." Better. The word felt wrong immediately. "Better for who?" I asked. "For everyone," she said, too quickly. "They didn't want any tension. You know how sensitive things have been." That was when I understood this hadn't been spontaneous. It had been decided, discussed, justified. The door hadn't been locked in the moment. It had been locked in advance, with careful reasoning meant to sound kind. Over the next few days, similar conversations unfolded. No one sat me down. No one offered a full explanation. Instead, I was given fragments, half-truths wrapped in concern. They were worried about your feelings. They didn't want drama. They thought you might be uncomfortable. Each explanation painted the same picture, exclusion reframed as protection. But protection doesn't look like silence. It doesn't look like locking someone out and pretending they don't exist. As more details surfaced, patterns became impossible to ignore. My independence had been discussed as distance. My honesty had been labeled as tension. My boundaries had been interpreted as rejection. Somewhere along the way, my presence had become inconvenient, not because I was cruel or careless, but because I didn't fit neatly into the story they wanted to tell about themselves. Jealousy surfaced in subtle ways. Not loud, dramatic envy, but the quiet resentment that grows when someone doesn't follow the same script. I had built a life that didn't revolve entirely around family approval, and that unsettled them more than I realized. My difference threatened the balance they relied on. Rather than confront that discomfort, they removed the source. Favoritism had played its part too. Some voices carried more weight than others. Some feelings mattered more. I had always known this vaguely, but seeing it clearly felt different. Painful, yes, but clarifying. Group loyalty demanded alignment, not authenticity. Those who questioned too much became liabilities. What hurt most was how gently it had all been framed. No one said, "We don't want you here." Instead, they said, "We thought this would be easier." Easier for whom? Certainly not for me, standing in the cold, questioning my worth. Their version of care was quiet, indirect, and devastatingly dismissive. I began to understand that this wasn't about one night or one holiday. Christmas Eve had simply exposed what had been true for a long time. I had been tolerated, not embraced. Included when convenient, sidelined when uncomfortable. The lock on the door had been symbolic long before it was physical. Anger arrived slowly, reluctantly. I didn't want it. I had been trained not to want it. But once it settled in, it brought clarity with it. I saw how often my discomfort had been minimized to preserve collective harmony. How often I had been asked to adjust, to soften, to be less. That wasn't love. It was control disguised as peace. One conversation in particular stayed with me. A family member said, "You know how everyone gets when emotions run high. They were just trying to keep things calm." Calm at whose expense? I realized then how deeply the fear of conflict ran in our family. Disagreement wasn't seen as growth. It was seen as threat. And I, with my questions and boundaries, had become a reminder that their version of togetherness required silence. Rather than face that truth, they chose exclusion. Group loyalty had won. Individual truth had been sacrificed. The hardest part wasn't accepting that they had done this. It was accepting that they believed they were being kind. That belief insulated them from accountability. If harm is committed in the name of care, it becomes nearly impossible to challenge without being labeled ungrateful or dramatic. I felt a familiar urge rise in me, the desire to explain myself, to make them understand that I hadn't meant to cause trouble. But I stopped. For once, I let that impulse pass. I wasn't responsible for managing their discomfort. I didn't need to soften the truth to make it more palatable. Love, I realized, doesn't require erasure. It doesn't demand silence. It doesn't lock doors and call it protection. The silence that followed these revelations felt different from the silence before. Less confusing, more honest. I no longer waited for messages that wouldn't come. I no longer rehearsed explanations no one asked for. The truth beneath the silence had revealed itself, and while it hurt, it also grounded me. I grieved, not just the night I lost, but the illusion I had carried for years. I had believed belonging was unconditional. Now I understood the conditions clearly, and I knew I could no longer meet them without losing myself. That realization marked a turning point. Pain remained, sharp and undeniable, but alongside it grew something steadier. Acceptance. Not of what they had done, but of what it meant. The family I thought I had was real in memory, but incomplete in truth. And the love I deserved couldn't exist where I had to disappear to keep the peace. As the silence settled, I finally understood what had been taken from me and what had quietly been given in return. I had lost the illusion of unconditional belonging, but I had gained something just as important, the clarity to see that my worth was never defined by their fear. The door had closed, but in that closure, another one had opened, leading somewhere uncertain, yes, but honest. And for the first time, I felt ready to walk through it. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like dust after something shatters, revealing the shape of what broke only after the noise fades. I wasn't locked out because of a misunderstanding or a single bad decision. I was locked out because, in some quiet and fundamental way, I had never truly belonged in the way I believed I did. Once that thought surfaced, I couldn't push it away. I began to see my place in the family with painful clarity, not as the center, not even as an equal edge, but as the adjustable piece. The one expected to bend when space got tight. The one whose absence caused the least disruption. I had mistaken familiarity for acceptance, proximity for belonging. What I had actually been was useful, convenient, and expendable. That truth hurt more than the night itself. I looked back at my life through this new lens, and suddenly the patterns stood out unmistakably. I was the one who smoothed conflicts, who stayed neutral, who absorbed tension so others didn't have to feel it. When disagreements surfaced, I was expected to understand both sides and quietly step aside. When emotions ran high, I was told I was strong enough to handle it. Strength, I realize now, had been code for endurance. I endured by shrinking. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that my authenticity had always been a problem. I asked questions when silence was preferred. I named discomfort when others wanted comfort. I didn't explode or demand attention, but I also didn't disappear completely. That balance made me unpredictable, and unpredictability threatened the fragile equilibrium my family relied on. Belonging in my family came with rules, unspoken ones but rigid all the same. Don't disrupt the narrative. Don't expose the cracks. Don't make others examine themselves too closely. I had broken those rules simply by being honest in small, persistent ways, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make people uneasy. And unease, I now understood, was unforgivable. I had been labeled without being told. Difficult, sensitive, too independent, too detached. Labels that allowed my exclusion to feel reasonable rather than cruel. If I was the problem, then locking me out wasn't betrayal, it was self-preservation. That logic had protected them from guilt and left me holding the pain alone. The realization was devastating, but it was also clarifying. I stopped asking what I had done wrong and started asking why I had tried so hard to fit into a space that required me to be smaller. Acceptance, I saw now, had always come with a quiet price. My voice, my needs, my truth. Self-respect entered the conversation reluctantly. It felt unfamiliar, even dangerous. I had been taught that preserving family harmony was more important than personal comfort. But harmony built on erasure isn't harmony at all. It's compliance dressed up as love. I grieved deeply in those days, not just for the rejection, but for the years I spent believing that endurance was proof of worth. I mourned the version of myself who waited patiently for inclusion instead of questioning why it felt conditional. That grief was heavy, but it was honest. And honesty, I was learning, is transformative. I thought about how often I had been praised for being easy, how rarely I had been asked what I needed, how silence had been interpreted as agreement rather than survival. The family didn't know how to hold someone who refused to play a fixed role, and instead of adapting, they removed the variable. I wasn't meant to fit because fitting required conformity, and I had outgrown that without realizing it. That understanding shifted something fundamental inside me. The pain didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became less about longing and more about recognition. I wasn't unwanted because I was unlovable. I was unwanted because I couldn't be controlled without losing myself. Acceptance versus self-respect stood clearly before me, no longer abstract concepts but lived realities. Acceptance meant returning to silence, to shrinking, to pretending nothing had happened. Self-respect meant standing in the truth, even if it meant standing alone. For the first time, the choice felt clear. I stopped replaying conversations, stopped searching for the sentence that could have saved me. There was no sentence, no single moment, just years of quiet misalignment finally exposed. The lock on the door hadn't created the divide, it revealed it. There was relief in that clarity, even as it hurt. I no longer needed to prove my worth to people who measured love by compliance. I no longer needed to audition for belonging. The role they wanted me to play was one I could no longer perform without betraying myself. That night, sitting alone in my apartment, I felt something unexpected alongside the sadness. A small, steady sense of resolve. I had survived the rejection. I had named it. And in doing so, I had reclaimed something essential. Belonging, I realized, is not about proximity or history. It's about being able to exist fully without fear of exclusion. And if that wasn't possible in my family, then I would have to build it elsewhere, or within myself. The realization marked a turning point. I was no longer chasing explanations or apologies. I was choosing understanding. I was choosing myself. I didn't know yet what that choice would cost me. I only knew what it had already given me, the truth. And the truth, once seen, had changed everything. I had never been meant to fit into a system that required my silence. And finally, I was ready to stop trying. I stood at the edge of a decision I couldn't delay anymore, knowing silence was no longer neutral. Distance promised safety, confrontation promised damage, and both demanded courage. I asked myself which pain I could live with, the quiet ache of disappearance or the sharp wound of truth spoken aloud. Power felt distant then, like something other people possessed. Vulnerability was mine, heavy and unavoidable. Still, something inside me insisted that choosing myself required action, even if that action looked like loss. The question wasn't whether to respond, it was how. That moment defined everything that followed for me now. I chose to confront them, not because I expected understanding, but because I needed boundaries. I called and asked to meet, my voice steady despite the tremor underneath. We gathered in the living room where Christmas lights still blinked, mocking the seriousness of the moment. Faces I loved looked guarded, prepared. I felt small and exposed, yet strangely grounded. Control shifted as I spoke, numbing the lock, the silence, the choice they made. Their discomfort filled the room, and for once I didn't rush to ease it. My hands shook, but my resolve did not break in that moment alone. They denied intention first, framing events as misunderstandings and timing errors. Hearing that hurt more than anger would have. It reduced my experience to inconvenience. I listened without interrupting, noticing familiar tactics emerge. Concern sounded like dismissal. Explanations felt rehearsed. Someone said they were protecting me, that they feared conflict, that emotions were high. I asked when my consent became optional. The room went quiet. Vulnerability met control, and control faltered under direct questions. Eyes shifted, breaths held, and the old hierarchy revealed itself plainly. I stayed seated, present, refusing to soften my words or rescue their comfort anymore now. Defensiveness followed quickly. Voices tightened, memories revised, intentions polished. I watched denial stack carefully, brick by brick, until a wall stood between us. They spoke of family unity, of traditions worth preserving, of love expressed quietly. I spoke of doors locked and calls unanswered. Power tried to reassert itself through guilt, reminding me of sacrifices made, favors given. I acknowledged them without surrendering ground. Boundaries are not punishments, I said. They are clarity when love becomes conditional. The words hung heavy, undeniable, reshaping the space between us. No one interrupted. No one apologized. No one advanced further. That mattered then. At one point, someone cried, and the room shifted again. Tears changed the temperature. Demanding caretaking I had always provided. My instinct surged to comfort, to repair, to retreat. Instead, I stayed still. Vulnerability doesn't mean self-erasure. I named the impact rather than the intent. I said exclusion harms regardless of rationale. Control lost its grip when I refused the familiar role. For the first time, my pain was not absorbed. It was witnessed, uncomfortable and unresolved. Silence returned, different now, edged with accountability and consequence. I breathed slowly, holding space I once would have abandoned to keep peace intact. When the conversation ended, nothing was fixed. There were no apologies, no promises, no neat resolution, but something essential had shifted. I had spoken without pleading. I had listened without surrendering. Distance remained an option, no longer a punishment, but a choice. Power and vulnerability had changed places. I left knowing they understood me, even if they didn't accept me. That knowledge felt heavier than reconciliation, but lighter than silence. Walking away, I felt grief and strength coexist without canceling each other. The peak had passed, leaving clarity in its wake. I knew the aftermath would demand honesty and distance. I chose distance afterward, not as punishment, but as protection. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped chasing acknowledgement. Silence became intentional rather than imposed. Boundaries settled into place, firm and necessary. Control dissolved without my participation. Vulnerability transformed into strength through consistency. I answered messages briefly, honestly, without justification. Each interaction tested my resolve, and each time I chose myself again. The decision echoed, steadying me for what came next. It wasn't dramatic, but it was definitive, reshaping my sense of agency. Power no longer dictated my presence, choice did. That distinction carried me forward into uncertain but honest territory. The confrontation had been the peak, but the boundary was the victory. I learned that vulnerability paired with clarity dismantles manipulation. I no longer argued facts or intentions. I stated impact and enforced limits. Control requires engagement to survive. Without it, it withers. I felt grief still, but it was cleaner now, less tangled with shame. Acceptance of reality replaced hope for approval, and that trade strengthened me quietly. I was no longer negotiating my worth within rooms that demanded silence. This choice reshaped my future, even as it mourned the past. Strength felt earned, not assigned finally and fully. In choosing my response, I learned power is not volume but steadiness. Vulnerability is not exposure without protection, but truth with boundaries. The family dynamic resisted change, but I no longer needed permission to step back. I grieved, I rested, I recalibrated. Distance created room to breathe. Control lost relevance when I reclaimed agency. This moment defined me more than their choice ever could. The emotional peak passed, leaving a quieter strength I trusted. I understood consequences would follow, but they would be mine to manage. That certainty steadied me as relationships rearranged themselves without my constant intervention anymore there. The choice between confrontation and distance resolved into balance. I had confronted with honesty and chosen distance with intention. Both were acts of self-respect. The peak had revealed what mattered: boundaries over approval, truth over comfort. As I moved forward, I carried grief, clarity, and strength together. The story would continue, but on terms I finally controlled. This decision marked the turning point, reshaping every relationship afterward. I felt prepared for fallout, grounded in boundaries I would not abandon. The confrontation had ended, but its meaning would continue unfolding. I stepped forward steady into the consequences I chose myself alone. Afterward, reactions rippled unevenly. Some withdrew, others attempted normalcy, a few reached out cautiously. I met each response with consistency, not hostility. Boundaries require repetition, not explanation. Vulnerability remained present, but it was self-directed now, tended carefully. I noticed how quickly pressure faded when I didn't engage old patterns. Control needs participation. Without it, influence weakens. This realization fortified me, reminding me that my steadiness mattered more than their approval. I stopped waiting for validation and began trusting my internal compass. That shift carried me through difficult days with quiet confidence earned slowly and without apology from anyone there now. I reflected on power differently then. It no longer meant being heard by everyone, but hearing myself clearly. Vulnerability no longer meant exposure to harm, but honesty protected by limits. I could mourn the family I wanted while releasing the family I had. That distinction freed me from endless bargaining. The emotional peak had stripped illusions away, leaving principles behind. I chose to live by them, even when it felt lonely. Loneliness felt preferable to erasure, clearer than conditional belonging. I learned resilience grows when choices align with values consistently. That alignment became my anchor moving forward without compromise again. Distance created space for recalibration. I filled it with rest, reflection, and honest conversations elsewhere. I learned my worth didn't diminish without proximity. Boundaries clarified relationships quickly. Some connections faded, others deepened unexpectedly. Control receded where authenticity prevailed. Vulnerability strengthened as I practiced self-trust. The confrontation had been necessary, but distance proved sustainable. I could move forward without constant explanation, carrying lessons rather than wounds. The family narrative shifted without my participation, and I accepted that. Acceptance didn't mean agreement. It meant releasing responsibility for outcomes. My energy returned as I redirected it inward toward healing and growth alone safely. Choosing my response defined the peak and prepared the aftermath. I confronted to honor truth, and I stepped back to protect integrity. Power no longer intimidated me. Vulnerability no longer weakened me. Control gave way to boundaries, and silence transformed into choice. This moment closed one chapter and opened another. I walked forward changed, steady, ready to face consequences with clarity and compassion. The decision echoed beyond the room, shaping relationships and self-understanding. I carried grief gently now, guided by principles I trusted. This was not escape, but alignment at last. I accepted distance as an act of love selfward. The aftermath didn't arrive with explosions or dramatic confrontations. It arrived quietly, in the absence of things I once took for granted. Fewer messages, fewer invitations, a noticeable pause where tradition used to live. Losing my family didn't happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, like a room emptying without anyone announcing they were leaving. At first, I kept expecting a reset, an apology, a moment where someone would say, "We went too far." But days turned into weeks, and the silence settled into something permanent. The realization hurt more than anger ever could. It confirmed what Christmas Eve had already shown me. The rupture wasn't temporary, it was structural. Relationships shifted almost immediately. Some family members became distant, polite but unreachable. Others acted as if nothing had happened, offering small talk without acknowledgement. That hurt in a different way. It felt like being erased twice, once by exclusion and again by denial. I learned quickly that clarity often costs familiarity. Traditions began to lose their meaning. The holidays passed without their usual pull. Songs that once comforted me now sounded hollow. Family recipes felt heavy, tied to memories that no longer felt safe. I boxed up decorations earlier than usual, surprised by how little resistance I felt. Letting go hurt, but holding on hurt more. Grief changed shape in this aftermath. I wasn't just grieving a night or an argument. I was grieving the family I thought I had, the one that promised unconditional belonging. That version existed vividly in my memory, but it no longer matched reality. Accepting that required dismantling years of belief, and that process was slow and painful. There were moments when doubt returned, whispering that maybe I should have stayed silent. That maybe peace, even a false one, was better than this emptiness. But those thoughts faded when I remembered the cost of silence, the way I had shrunk to fit, the way my truth had been treated as disruption. Losing family hurt, but losing myself would have hurt more. Something unexpected happened as weeks passed. The constant tension I carried began to ease. Without the pressure to maintain harmony, my body relaxed in ways I hadn't noticed were missing. I slept better. I spoke more freely with people who didn't require performance. Liberation crept in quietly, almost guiltily, alongside the loss. Destruction had cleared space. In that space, self-truth began to form. I saw how much energy I had spent managing others' comfort, how much of my identity had been shaped around being agreeable, adaptable, quiet. Without that role, I felt unmoored at first. Then, slowly, I felt lighter. Clarity replaced confusion. I no longer questioned my perception of events. I trusted myself again. New boundaries changed other relationships too. Friends noticed the shift. Conversations deepened. I stopped apologizing for my feelings. The contrast was striking. Where family connection had demanded erasure, other connections thrived on honesty. That comparison was painful but instructive. I allowed myself to grieve fully. Some days that meant crying unexpectedly. Other days it meant anger surfacing without warning. I let it happen. Grief, I learned, doesn't follow a schedule. It moves when it's ready. Each wave carried loss, but also understanding. There was a particular sadness in realizing that the people who hurt me didn't see themselves as cruel. They believed they were maintaining peace. That belief created distance I couldn't cross. Accepting that meant releasing the need for validation. They didn't need to understand my pain for it to be real. As traditions faded, I began creating new ones quietly. Morning walks, dinners with chosen family, small rituals that didn't demand silence or sacrifice. These moments felt tentative at first, but they grew steadier. Belonging, I discovered, can be built intentionally. It doesn't have to be inherited. Loss and liberation existed side by side in this season. Some nights, the absence felt unbearable. Other nights, the clarity felt like a gift. I held both without trying to resolve them. Growth doesn't require choosing one over the other. It requires allowing both to exist honestly. The destruction of my old family narrative had forced me into self-truth. I could no longer pretend that endurance was love or that silence was kindness. I had seen too much. That knowledge was irreversible, and strangely, it steadied me. I knew where I stood, even if it meant standing alone at times. I stopped reaching out first. I stopped waiting. The ache softened into acceptance. Relationships that survived did so because they adapted. Others faded naturally. That process hurt, but it also simplified my emotional landscape. What remained was real. In the quiet aftermath, I learned that clarity is not comfort, but it is freedom. Losing my family as I knew them felt like a death. Finding myself in the aftermath felt like survival. I was no longer confused about my worth or my place. I knew who I was without their approval. Pain had stripped away illusions, leaving something sturdier behind. I had lost a version of family built on conditions, but I had gained honesty. And honesty, though heavy, allowed me to breathe again. The aftermath didn't heal me overnight, but it gave me direction. I was no longer trying to return to a door that had closed. I was walking forward, carrying grief, clarity, and a growing sense of self-trust. Loss had taken much from me, but it had also given me something essential, the truth about where I stood and the freedom to choose where I would go next. The next Christmas arrived quietly. No countdown, no frantic planning, no pressure to perform joy on command. December came and went like a gentle tide, and for the first time in my life, I didn't measure my worth by where I was expected to be on Christmas Eve. The absence that once terrified me had softened into something livable, even peaceful. I spent that Christmas alone by choice, not because I had nowhere to go, but because I finally understood the difference. I decorated sparingly, a few lights in the window, a small tree that didn't demand attention. There was no audience to impress, no silence to endure. The quiet felt intentional, almost sacred. At first, memories tried to intrude. The old rituals surfaced automatically, the noise, the chaos, the forced togetherness. I let them pass without resistance. I didn't romanticize them. I didn't rewrite them. I saw them clearly for what they were, moments of warmth mixed with expectation, love mixed with condition. That clarity hurt less than denial ever had. I cooked a simple meal and ate slowly, noticing how different it felt to take up space without fear. There was no tension in my shoulders, no constant scanning for approval. I realized how much of myself I had been withholding all those years, shrinking to maintain access to belonging that was never unconditional to begin with. This Christmas didn't feel empty. It felt honest. I thought about family differently then, not as a fixed group defined by blood or obligation, but as a living concept shaped by safety, respect, and choice. I had always believed family meant endurance, that love required tolerating discomfort in silence. Now I understood that love without dignity isn't love at all. It's control disguised as tradition. Belonging, I learned, begins internally. It starts when you stop abandoning yourself to be included. That lesson came at a high cost, but it had given me something invaluable in return: self-integrity. I no longer needed to audition for connection or apologize for my existence. I had earned the right to choose peace over proximity. I heard from a few family members that day. Brief messages, polite, careful. I responded kindly without overextending. Boundaries held firm without hostility. The contrast between who I was then and who I had been a year earlier struck me deeply. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hopping for a door to open. I had built my own. There was strength in that realization, quiet and steady. Not the loud kind that demands recognition, but the kind that settles into your bones and stays. Past rejection no longer defined me. It informed me. It taught me what I would no longer accept and what I would protect fiercely. That night I went for a walk. The neighborhood glowed softly, houses lit with care, some full, some quiet like mine. I felt connected in a different way, not to a single family unit, but to the shared human experience of longing, loss, and resilience. Everyone carries something unseen. Mine no longer felt shameful. I realized then that survival isn't dramatic. It's subtle. It shows up as rest, as honesty, as refusing to return to places that require your disappearance. This Christmas wasn't about proving strength. It was about honoring it. Conditional love had once shaped my understanding of belonging. Now self-integrity did. The difference was profound. I felt anchored, grounded in choices that aligned with who I truly was rather than who I needed to be to stay included. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt whole. As midnight passed, I turned off the lights and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the quiet. There was no countdown, no spectacle, just breath, presence, and the steady awareness that I had survived something that once felt unbearable. The door that closed on me had changed everything, but it had not ended me. It had redirected me toward honesty, toward peace, toward a life where Christmas no longer symbolized rejection but renewal. I went to bed that night without dread or longing, just acceptance. The kind that comes when you stop trying to return to what hurt you and start honoring what healed you. This was a different kind of Christmas. And for the first time, it felt like mine. I didn't know then that I was walking toward the moment when tradition would turn against me, that the very thing I trusted most would become the source of my deepest confusion. I still believed Christmas was home. I still believed belonging was guaranteed. And because I believed that, I didn't see the rupture forming beneath the surface, waiting for the exact moment to reveal itself.